Ladies and gentlemen, the B-2 bomber might be one of the most iconic aircraft designs in all of American history, and it's all over the news right now because it just turned Iran into I-limp in 37 hours. Some of the features that make this aircraft so insane include its operational altitude, its small radar cross-section, and the material that it's made out of, all features that it owes to this plane. Hello everyone, today we're going to be exploring the history and insane lengths to which the United States went in order to create one of the most iconic and revolutionary aircraft of all time, Project Archangel, aka the SR-71. And full disclosure, the SR-71, while the most famous, is just one member of a family of aircraft including the A-12, the YF-12, and the SR-71, all different airplanes operated by different agencies. However, for the sake of this video, I'm focusing on the family of aircraft as a whole and the amazing engineering that went into creating them. So if I refer to them as the SR-71 when it's actually an A-12 or a YF-12, don't yell at me. Now with all of that out of the way, we're gonna get into it, and thank you for watching. The 1960s was the height of the Cold War, with Russia and the United States spying on each other any way that they could. You had the CIA putting antennas inside cats to try and listen to KGB agents. The KGB was sending America seals and decorations for offices that were really listening devices, you know, basically living in a Looney Tunes sketch. But one of the more conventional ways was through spy planes, and in the early 1960s, the United States was using the U-2, aka the Dragon Lady. The U-2 had one special advantage that made it a phenomenal spy plane. It could fly at over 80,000 feet in altitude, which meant it was very hard for Soviet missiles to shoot down. Unfortunately, it was an advantage that would soon be taken away. Meet Gary Powers. If you're a Soviet, he's an American spy that was just shot down by a Soviet missile in one of the most advanced spy planes in the world. If you're the US government, he's a high-altitude weather enthusiast. Yeah, after being shot down in a U-2 spy plane carrying a 1911 pistol and a poisoned dart, the Soviet Union questioned the US government, who denied everything, but it was pretty obvious that he was a spy, and the US eventually admitted this, and this incident would sever a lot of the goodwill that had been building between the Soviet Union and the United States. But what it also did was highlight that the U-2 was now vulnerable to Soviet missiles and America had to do something about it. And the something they did would lead to one of the greatest engineering feats of the 20th century. Now, the Gary Powers incident happened on May 1st of 1960, but the CIA had already been thinking about creating a new spy plane shortly after the U-2 was introduced, but the Powers incident really sealed that need. Now, put yourself in the CIA shoes, right? What are we to do? The plane that we already spent years developing and millions of dollars on is now obsolete. How are we going to justify our insane budget of taxpayer money and Black Ops missions if we don't have a plane that can spy good? What they decide to do is approach perhaps the greatest aircraft engineer of all time, Kelly Johnson, give him a spec sheet and tell him to figure it out. And figure it out he does. For those who don't know, a spec sheet for government contracts is a list of requirements that need to be met in order to secure a contract, and Kelly Johnson has a history of outdoing spec sheets. For you to understand how big of a deal that Kelly Johnson is now involved, you need to understand this man's rap sheet. One of the designers of the Model 9D Orion, the first airliner with retractable landing gear, a designer on the Model 10 Electra, which was flown by Amelia Earhart, and he is the founding president of Lockheed's Skunk Works, which is responsible for such planes as the F-117 Nighthawk, the P-38, the C-130, the F-22 Raptor, and yes, the U-2 spy plane. And real quick, I need to rant about the P-38 because it outperformed the spec sheet that the US gave it by a wide margin. Before World War II, America was trying to build a plane that was going to be good at everything. They wanted all the upsides of bombers, none of the downsides. All the upsides of fighters, none of the downsides. So they created a spec sheet and sent it out to their contractors, and it's basically impossible. And it reads, travel at 360 miles in level flight, have 4 50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, climb to 20,000 feet in 6 minutes, and carry 1,000 pounds of bombs. And that might not sound like a lot now, but back in 1940, pretty much everybody thought that this was going to be impossible. Like at this point in time, nobody's going to be able to do this. And Kelly Johnson really isn't having the whole idea of something being impossible, so he decides to go against the conventional way of building a fighter or a pursuit plane, which is the one central engine. Instead, they built it with two. The plane exceeds expectations in pretty much every metric. The P-38 tops out at roughly 413 to 426 miles an hour, which is almost 100 miles an hour faster than any other plane that they're going to be encountering during the war. The point I'm trying to make is the P-38 doesn't get the recognition that it deserves when talking about World War II airplanes, despite the fact that America's greatest ace pilot, Richard Bong, flew a P-38 for his entire career. And Kelly Johnson and his teams were the ones that made that possible. And Johnson is the guy that America has now put up against the Soviets, and he is about to do what I can only describe as using black magic and white nose powder in order to get that done. Oh, and I almost forgot. The spec sheet reads like this. Must fly at an elevation over 85,000 feet, operate at temperatures as low as -90 and as high as 800 degrees Fahrenheit, travel 3 times the speed of sound, have a small radar cross-section, and carry advanced electronic countermeasures and communications equipment. This is impossible. Johnson would discover very quickly that in order to meet this spec sheet, this aircraft is going to have to be built unlike any aircraft before it, and he's going to need to use a whole lot of magic. Fortunately for him, apparently when you work for the CIA, there's plenty of magic to go around. Johnson and his team would soon discover that in order to operate at the high altitudes and temperatures required for this spec sheet, they were going to have to build it out of titanium and other high-temperature materials. For the other materials, they went about creating new high-temperature plastics, electric wiring, and plugs, but the titanium, there was a bit of a problem. See, the US didn't have enough titanium in its reserves to test and build this aircraft, so they had to go get some. The only problem with that is the place that has the most titanium is Russia, the people we're trying to spy on. And this is where the magic of the CIA comes in. See, the US can't just call up Russia and say, hey, I need you to sell me some titanium so I can build this really cool spy plane. Who are you going to use it to spy on? Not you. That's obviously not going to work, so the CIA did what they do best and lied their asses off. What that actually looked like was the establishment of shell companies that were several degrees removed from any ties to the United States, and using those companies to buy the titanium and then ship it over here. And one of the companies told the Soviets that they were using the titanium to create super specialized pizza ovens. No, I'm not kidding. Which, I know you probably hear that and think there's no way the Soviets bought this, and first off, you have to take into account that these companies are several steps removed from the United States, so the Soviets probably didn't have any idea what was going on, and second of all, you have to realize that these are communists. They have no idea what calorie-dense food like pizza is, let alone how you cook it, and Gorbachev isn't going to bring Pizza Hut until 1997. So now Johnson and his team of wizards have acquired the titanium they need to start building the aircraft, but even this proves difficult. Now, you might not know this living in 2025, where it seems like titanium is being used in everything from your phone to like card-carrying wallets, but back when this was being built, there was very little in terms of machining equipment for titanium, and it was a relatively new metal that we were using to build stuff with. It was not the well-studied material that it is today. What this means is that Johnson and his crew now have to create new ways to machine the metal in order for it to work. Johnson himself said that when they started the project, they could only drill about 17 holes in the titanium before it completely ruined their drill. But by the end of the project, they could drill over 100 holes and they could resharpen their bits. Like, they're having to create new tools in order to build the material to create a new plane. They also learned that titanium is actually a pretty finicky metal, and even the water that was used to cool the welds impacted the strength of the welds based on the time of year that they were using it, because the chemicals that were put into the water in Burbank that were supposed to keep algae from growing in the summer would actually weaken the welds. So they created completely new ways of welding and cooling welds in order for them to still function. Johnson even complained about the quality of certain processes for the metal, saying, quote, "Throughout this and other programs, it has become crystal clear to me that our country is in need of a 250,000-ton metal forming press, 5 times as large as our biggest one available today. When we have to machine away 90% of our rough forgings today, both in titanium and aluminum, it seems that we are nationally very stupid. My best and continuing efforts to solve this problem have been defeated for many years. Incidentally, the USSR has been much smarter in the field. In that way, they have more and larger forging presses than we do. So it seems like even in the 1960s, people were complaining about American manufacturing. Because they were having to operate at such varying temperatures, even the O-rings and hoses for certain fluids had to be specifically built, and there was a particularly funny incident involving them trying to solve the hydraulic fluid issue. While in the middle of working on the hydraulic systems, Johnson came across an article of a material that could withstand temperatures over 900 degrees. So he thinks to himself, well, this is perfect. I gotta get my hands on some of this and test it. So he gets in contact with the guy who created this, and he gets some of it shipped to the testing facility, and it arrives in a canvas sack. Wait, how do you ship a liquid in a canvas bag? It turns out that the material was a powder at room temperature, and Johnson discovered that this obviously isn't going to work because if they were going to use this, they would have to use blow torches in order to turn it to a liquid. So, back to the drawing board. They eventually created an oil-based liquid with the help of the University of Pennsylvania that worked extremely well as their hydraulic fluid, but it also cost them $130 a gallon, so they made sure that the hydraulic system had 0 leaks. The same, however, could not be said about the fuel system, which is the craziest part of the story, in my opinion. Quick metallurgical lesson for anyone who doesn't remember high school science. When you apply heat to a metal, it expands. If you've ever seen those super old metal pots that your mom or grandma cooks with that can't stay flat on the stove, you've seen this in action. That's just on your stove. Now, imagine you have to heat the metal to over 800 degrees. Imagine how much it would expand. Even though titanium is definitely more resistant to those temperatures than your grandmother's pot, it's definitely not resistant to physics, and as heat is applied to it, it expands just like every other metal. But unlike other metals, it's still super rigid and strong even at those temperatures, meaning if they built this aircraft like conventional planes with super tight seams, as the titanium expands, it would essentially tear itself apart. What all of this means is they had to build the plane loose on the ground so that as it heated up, it would fit together properly, meaning that the airplane would leak fuel while it was on the ground and even when it was in the early stages of flight at lower speeds. Now, I don't have to tell you that leaking fuel, not a good thing, especially a jet fuel, and extra especially on a black aircraft flying out of Burbank, California. So just to count up the engineering no-goes about this plane, it's built out of a material that's basically impossible to work. It uses liquids that have to be specifically fabricated from scratch and not very easily, and it's built so loose that it leaks the most flammable liquid that it carries. Obviously, we're gonna scrap this whole project, right? Wrong. We're gonna make jet fuel that is inflammable. I'm not kidding. Let me introduce you to one of Johnson's fellow wizards, Clarence Brown Eichmann. Eichmann is a chemical engineer for Pratt & Whitney, the company that is designing the engines for the SR-71. And Eichmann is the definition of a potions master because he creates the most magical thing about this plane, if you ask me. After several years of working trying to create a fuel that can withstand the operating temperatures of this aircraft, he creates a fuel known as JP7. JP, Jet Propulsion 7, the 7th iteration, I guess, which has a very high flash point. A flash point is the lowest temperature that a liquid gives off fumes or vapor to the point that it can be ignited. Now, gasoline has a very low flash point, which is why you have to be very careful with how you transport it, and it also makes it to where engines can be relatively simple in how they operate to ignite it. Little sparks, or spark plugs, can be used to ignite it in an engine. JP7's flash point is so high that you can put cigars out in it, which is a rumor that whether you believe the pilots actually put their cigars out in the fuel or not, the fact that they could do it is absolutely insane. And I know that your next question is going to be the same question that I had. If you can't ignite it with a match, how the hell do you get the plane to burn it? You use a muscle car engine, obviously. It's a bit more complicated than that, but because they were so focused on speed with this aircraft, they needed to reduce weight every way that they could. So they opted not to have an ignition inside the plane because that can be extremely cumbersome, and so they created what they call a start cart. Basically what they did is they took 2 V8 engines and stuck them in a rolling cart that connected to the aircraft via basically a giant piston that required 700 pounds of torque in order to get the engine to start spinning. Then the engine would eject a little bit of fuel in what is known as TEB. TEB, or triethylborine, is a chemical that's flash point is so low that when you expose it to oxygen, it automatically ignites and it has a bright green flame. And if you've gotten this far into the video and don't believe that the people who built this are wizards, the fact that they have to cast Fireball in order to start it should seal the deal. And it's not just Fireball, they got the special color, which if video games taught me anything means they're super high level mages. And here we have a very basic drawing of the engine assembly for the SR-71. And no, I didn't change clothes and cut my hair. I am also a wizard and I'm able to change my appearance. I certainly didn't forget to film this with the rest of the video. Anyway, if you're not familiar with how aircraft engines work, it's very similar in this. However, there's some very unique things about the SR-71 that we're going to get into. But basically, air intake comes into this section here, which is actually the engine itself. It passes through a series of static and moving, rotating blades, almost like a really gnarly blender, but for an aircraft. And what that does is makes the air continue to go backwards, but it also pressurizes it so that once fuel is injected into the burner, it creates forward thrust as it exits the engine. Now, what makes this engine so unique is actually up here and in the design of the actual body of the aircraft that surrounds the engine. This forward piece here, which is also one of the most iconic things about the aircraft design, is called an inlet spike. And what this does is it controls the shock wave once the aircraft is traveling faster than the speed of sound. So at this point, if the aircraft was traveling at the speed of sound, the shock wave would form like this, meaning that all the air behind this is going to be a lower pressure as it enters into the actual aircraft and into the engine so that it can use it for propulsion. But as the aircraft speeds up, this actually retracts further back into the aircraft, which means that the spike itself is further back, meaning that the shock wave is also further back, and once it hits its full cruising speed, the shock wave actually lines up perfectly with the outer part of the aircraft body. What this does is allows the aircraft to maximize the efficiency of the air that it is using. Now, once the air actually enters into the intake, it does what's called diffusion. So basically it goes from being supersonic air at a very low pressure. Again, remember they're flying at 80,000+ feet and the air is fairly thin. But once the air is moving so fast, it's extremely thin. But once it enters here and diffuses, it actually bounces up and down inside the aircraft before diffusing further in here. What it does is it creates more pressure. So the aircraft, once the sonic boom or the sonic shock wave is hitting the inlet spike, all of that supersonic air comes inside and slows down, meaning that it builds pressure. And similar to how a car engine works, where you use air injected with fuel and then pressurize it in order to actually create the explosion, which creates the drive, it's similar to what happens here. The air continues to be diffused by the blades in the engine, and then eventually makes its way here to where the actual burners are. I didn't draw them because it's a very complicated look and it's hard to make work with a whiteboard. It's in these burners that you have little fuel injections into this highly pressurized air that then is ignited by the TEB and the previously burning jet fuel, causing the actual burner to give you thrust. Now, one of the other things that's very special about the SR-71's engine is its afterburner. So anybody who doesn't know, an afterburner actually functions by taking the spare oxygen that is left in the air that's already been burned and ejects more fuel into it, creating a higher fuel to air ratio, which creates an insane amount of thrust out of the back of the aircraft. However, afterburners are extremely inefficient when it comes to fuel consumption. But where the SR-71 makes up for that is in the fact that it has this inlet. Now, at the lower speeds that the aircraft is flying, there is no sonic boom, which means it's just taking in air like a normal aircraft, meaning if it's using afterburner at those slower speeds, it is less efficient. However, once it starts making it up to its cruising speed is where things get interesting. If you look, and hopefully you can see, there's these little gate-looking things here on the aircraft right inside the inlet spike area. What these do is actually open to allow airflow to go around the aircraft body and over the engine in order to cool it at higher speeds, but then it will also re-enter into the afterburner and be used for more propulsion. So basically, when it's traveling at its cruising speed, it's taking in some of the Mach 3.2 air and then just ejecting it out the back to create more thrust and more efficiency for its afterburner. Again, I didn't draw it here, but it also has, at this section here where the diffusers are, it actually has these pipes that run along the back that run from this section here to the afterburner directly to take some of that highly pressurized air in here and again put it directly to the afterburner, again creating a highly efficient afterburner, which means unlike most aircraft which can only use afterburner for a couple seconds at a time due to the fuel inefficiency, the SR-71 can actually perpetually run in afterburner at its cruising speed and be more efficient. Also, another insane thing about the J-58 being such a powerful engine and needing the start carts like I mentioned in order to get it to actually sustain its own power, it is most fuel efficient at Mach 3.2, meaning they built this engine specifically to fit into the aircraft and specifically to go as fast as it does. And it's also why so many of the flights that it will eventually take are taken at such high speeds, because it's when it's most efficient, and because it requires aerial refueling, and because it leaks when it's not at its cruising speed, it is very fuel inefficient when not traveling as fast as it can. Now, I've zoomed in on a lot of what I believe to be the most incredible parts of this aircraft, but literally every piece of it is engineered and had to be created from the ground up. While not the first plane to have ejection seats, it would be the first to have to eject upwards of speeds of Mach 4 and maybe as high as 100,000 feet. This would require specialized suits for the pilots, special parachutes. All of this had to be built and tested before ever being implemented. They also had to create special windows in order for the cameras to take clear pictures, because normal glass becomes extremely difficult to see out of at Mach Jesus. The cameras they used were also very special in their own right, carrying anywhere from 5,000 to 12,000 feet of film and able to take photos of 41 square miles of terrain. They also placed listening equipment and high-frequency detectors that were able to pick up the radar frequencies of missile sites in order to locate Soviet missiles, which was the whole point of building the craft in the first place. So our wizards have finally solved all their problems and are finally ready for a test flight, but they can't just fly at the current testing facility because the runway was too short and they wanted to keep the aircraft as secret as possible, so they have to ship it to a new testing site in Groom Lake, Nevada. So how do you ship a plane, right? Normally with some of the smaller fighter jets, you can just throw them in a cargo plane, but this aircraft is massive. It's too big for them to be able to do that, so they take it apart and put it inside giant crates, put them on the backs of trucks. Yeah, they next day ground shipped a 107-foot long, 30-ton plane from Burbank, California to Groom Lake, Nevada. The boxes were so big that they had to remove road signs in some places, and they had the Highway Patrol and CIA security block off certain parts of the roadway in order to safely move it, and thank God they have pictures. So remember kids, whenever you see a suspicious looking box on the back of a truck, it's a secret government project. Don't let anybody tell you different. After making it to Nevada and reassembling the plane, on April 25th, 1962, after years of research and covert operations to acquire material, it's finally time for our first test flight. Our high-altitude spy craft is finally ready to change the world. The test pilot takes off and flies about 20 feet off the air before being put down in a lake bed right off the edge of the runway. The reason for this was, quote, lateral oscillations which were horrible to see. Translation, the plane is super unstable and wobbly. Crap. They get the plane out of the lake, they do some maintenance to hopefully solve the wobble, and the next day they get ready for take two. The second test flight lasted around 40 minutes and had less issues with the wobble. However, once the plane made it to about 300 feet, a bunch of the side panels started to fall off, which is terrifying as a pilot. Like, imagine you were driving down the road and once you hit 60 miles an hour, your hood and your door and panels started falling off. You'd be absolutely horrified. It took technicians 4 days to find and reattach all of the panels, and after a few other unofficial test flights, the plane made its first supersonic flight on May 4th, 1962. Over the next several years, testing continued on multiple different aircraft, and it finally started to reach sustained speeds above Mach 3 starting in 1963, and shortly after that, Johnson and his team started getting tons of complaints about the sonic booms from people in the area, and the number of UFO sightings skyrocketed, just like they did when the F-22 and the B-2 were in production, because it's never aliens, it's just Uncle Sam. The testing continued, and improvements were continually being made here and there to fix errors that showed up in the wiring and the construction of certain parts of the aircraft, but it wasn't without its problems or its crashes. During the testing phase, there were 3 separate crashes, and one of them I had to bring up because of how the pilot reacted. On May 24, 1963, pilot Ken Collins was flying through the clouds at about 30,000 feet, testing the navigation system. Suddenly, his altitude and airspeed readings weren't making any sense, and then without warning, the plane pitched up, stalled, and started spinning. He wasn't able to recover the aircraft, and he ejected at 25,000 feet before parachuting to the ground and making his way back to the test site. The crash was recovered and testing was shut down until they could find out what happened, and according to a CIA release document, quote, "So great was the need to find out what went wrong that Collins willingly took truth serum to help his memory." Because, you know, the 1960s. I also like to think that he understood what the CIA was willing to do for certain things, that he was like, no, I promise, I didn't do it. I'll take truth serum. You can trust me. The program would spend the next 4 years in this sort of limbo period. Constant testing and refining of parts and procedures was occurring while project leaders spent hours trying to get approval for a mission, but between 1963 and 1967, no approval for missions came. It was also during this time that the beginning of the end of the current variant, the A-12, began. Long story short, a bunch of budget concerns arose and were questioning as to why the CIA and the Air Force should both have programs focused on the same mission and based around the same family of aircraft. The CIA program directors fought to keep their version in the air until the official SR-71s ordered by the Air Force were operational, or perhaps even longer, but President Johnson officially set the program to end on January 1st, 1968. Unfortunately, again for the A-12, at this point in time, Russian air defense had become too advanced for the US government to comfortably put them into action as flyover aircraft over Russia, and the opportunity to use the plane to spy on Cuba came and went. It seems like the program is going to be scrapped before it ever flew a mission. I should also mention that it's during this time that the program suffered its first fatality. On January 5th, 1967, CIA pilot Walter Ray was killed when he ran out of fuel due to a faulty fuel gauge. After ejection around 30,000 feet, his parachute failed to open when he never separated from the seat. He plummeted to the ground and was killed on impact, still attached to his ejection seat. I think it's also important to note that all the previous crashes and Walter Ray's death were all caused by issues that were special to this plane. The ejection seat that Ray was in was specifically designed for this aircraft, and it just goes to show that sometimes the cost of innovation is paid for in human life. All the things I've just mentioned have been adding to the sense that Project Archangel is going to be canceled before it even has a chance to fly a mission. And it's starting to look like the only magic that Johnson and the CIA aren't capable of wielding is the magic needed to keep the program alive. However, it is around this time that the Johnson administration starts getting worried about North Vietnam's ability to launch surface-to-surface missiles into southern Vietnam without being detected. If this is true, it poses a huge safety threat to both American and South Vietnamese troops. And there's also concern about surface-to-air missiles that pose a threat to US aircraft for bombing raids that they were trying to do on the north. With these threats looming and understanding that the U-2 and the drones that we have are not going to be a safe option, and the current spy satellites don't have the versatility that they need, the mission of searching for and locating these sites finally gives our plane a chance. On May 17th, the logistical preparations begin as crews and maintenance equipment for 3 planes are airlifted to Gardena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. And a few days later, the planes arrive as well. And on May 31st, 1967, the first mission of Operation Black Shield and the A-12 begins. The mission itself was honestly nothing insane. The mission lasted about 3 hours and 49 minutes, flying at 80,000 feet and sustained speeds a Mach 3.1, completing a single pass over North Vietnam. During the mission, they captured footage of 70 SAM sites, a military training area, an airfield, and a port. This, along with the footage gathered over the next 28 missions, would provide US intelligence with photographs of pretty much the entirety of northern Vietnam. And all of these photographs were taken while flying an average of 12.5 minutes over the country, which again just proves how incredibly fast this aircraft can move. This intel would prove vital in Johnson's war plans for Vietnam and were a deciding factor in moving forward with the air raids into the north. During these missions, the aircraft would also have its first taste of being shot at. On 3 separate occasions over Vietnam, surface-to-air missiles were launched, and none of them were ever able to take it down. This was in part due to the electronic countermeasures that scrambled the radar signature used by the missile to track the aircraft, but also because of the plane's speed. And imagine you were a North Vietnamese soldier trying to shoot down a plane like you've probably done lots before, and then the plane just goes into hyperdrive and outruns your missile.
What the hell was that? Spaceball 1. They've gone to plaid.
The closest any of the missiles ever came was about 200 yards before detonating, which left a giant piece of shrapnel in one of the wings, but it wasn't enough damage to keep the plane from flying all the way back to the airbase in Okinawa. And although it wasn't enough to bring the plane down, it was certainly enough to make the pilots a little bit shy, and no missions were flown for several months. However, they would soon resume, completing the last of the 28 missions from December 1967 until March 1968. Soon, however, the A-12 variant would fly its last missions, successfully flying over North Korea in search for a United States naval vessel, the USS Pueblo. The photographs that proved that the ship was in North Korea were later used during negotiations that eventually led to the release of the captured sailors 11 months later. And also, that is basically the international incident of I have screenshots. But unfortunately, that would be the last hurrah for the A-12 variant of the aircraft. The CIA program would be ended, and the final flight of the A-12 occurred on June 21, 1968, flying from Groom Lake, Nevada to a storage facility in California. Unfortunately, the program would suffer its second fatality just over 2 weeks earlier. On June 4th, pilot Jack Weeks was doing a test flight after an engine replacement in order to make sure that the aircraft could actually make the long flight back to the United States. His last contact was made about 520 miles east of Manila in the Philippines. No wreckage of the plane was ever recovered, and it seemed to have just disappeared without a trace. Signals received back at base from the onboard aircraft monitoring system indicated a possible engine trouble, and the plane was ruled a loss to catastrophic failure. Jack Weeks would posthumously be awarded the CIA Star of Valor on June 26th, along with all the other operational pilots that had already returned home. The A-12 CIA variant of the aircraft would eventually be replaced by the Air Force's SR-71 variant, and the 2 aircraft completed 3,600 missions over 25 years, and after hundreds of attempts by multiple different adversaries, not a single one was ever shot down. And although 12 SR-71s were lost during their career from 1964 until 1998, not a single one was ever due to enemy action. And the SR-71 would forever stake its claim in the history books on June 27, 1976, when it would set the fixed-wing aircraft speed record at Mach 3.32. Now, this is the officially recognized record. However, many of the resources that I found in regards to the A-12 variant stated that the A-12 was actually able to reach faster speeds, but it was never put up for the actual record because at the time it was being kept so secret and the agency didn't want to put it into the spotlight that would be required in order to obtain that official record. Today, the SR-71 is most famous for being the fastest operational aircraft in history, a title it may have kept from its older brother simply because it was in the spotlight. But it's not its speed that inspired future aircraft design, but rather the innovations in stealth technology and fabrication. Kelly Johnson would use what he learned in the creation of the SR-71 to develop further stealth technology with aircraft like the F-117 Nighthawk that would later develop into craft like the F-22 Raptor, and yes, the B-2 bomber. I know that the B-2 was not created by Lockheed, but they still took what was learned from the creation of the SR-71 and applied it because they might be different companies, but they're on the same team. And yes, the SR-71 I walked so that the B-2 could I ran. And I would normally spend this part of the video talking about how there's some lesson to be learned that we can apply to our lives today, but there really isn't a lesson, at least not for Americans. No, today's lesson is for anyone who thinks it's a good idea to mess with America, okay? because when we really put the effort in, we create things that medieval peasants or even people today would call magic. Whether it's a portable star in the 1940s, a Mach 3 pizza oven in the 1960s, or removing pixels from your sky today, when America really tries, you should probably stay out of our way. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me in making these ridiculous videos, you can donate to my Beer and Books Fund. You can also share this video with any of your airplane nerd friends and watch their brains melt every time I have a picture of an A12 and I call it an SR-71 or vice versa. And I will see you in the next one. But in the meantime, go live a story worth telling. And as for this story, the end. Oh, I almost forgot. When I was researching, I found a ton of articles. I don't know if they were written by plane nerds or people who have no idea what they're talking about that said that the X-15 and the X-43 both flew faster than the SR-71 and the A-12 and that the record should go to them. I would be fine to hear that argument. However, the X-43 is not a piloted aircraft, so it doesn't even belong in this discussion, and both of them had to be launched by other aircraft. That doesn't make them planes, it makes them missiles. Okay, the SR-71 and the A-12 both took off from the ground, which, I don't know, should probably be a requirement for an airplane, and then they flew at Mach plaid and returned back to the ground. I might be alone, but it sounds like that should be kind of a requirement in order for a plane to get the airplane speed record. And we don't apply this to animals either, okay? If I go and Google the fastest flying animal in the world, it's not going to tell me humans because we've had help. It's going to tell me the peregrine falcon because it flies at 200 miles an hour and it does that shit by itself. I'm sorry, I got really frustrated in my research when I saw all these well-actually articles from people who probably read a Wikipedia article or saw a speed comparison video on YouTube and had decided that that made them an expert. Anyway, I'm gonna go call my cousin who works for Lockheed and ask them what they use for fuel now, because they invented magic in the 1960s. I bet they run off unicorn farts and fairy dust now. See you later.